Welcome back to All Day on this Thursday. It was earlier this week when the Minnesota Senate passed a major piece of legislation regarding gun safety. It covers certain gun control restrictions, assault weapons, but it also deals with school safety improvements, mental health improvements. It passed by one vote because the DFL controls the Senate by one vote. It passed purely along party lines, heads to the House where it may not even get heard on the floor because of the numbers there. Today we wanted to have a conversation with both sides of the aisle, one DFLer, one Republican, about this issue. We begin here with a senator from the DFL. Joining me now is Senate DFLer Ron Latz, who is the chair of the Senate Judiciary and Public Safety Committee. Thanks for taking time today.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Now, this has been a long journey for you. I know you convened the working group last September in the hopes of potentially a special session to address gun violence in the wake of the Annunciation shootings. A number of things discussed there that sort of made their way into this comprehensive legislation here. What has this been like starting in September now to get to the point where this has passed the Senate?
Well, it's been gut-wrenching, of course. I mean, this legislation was born out of tragedy at Annunciation, where 2 children lost their lives. Many others were permanently injured physically, and of course, the emotional, mental health issues, might last for a lifetime. And it was in the wake of the murder of Melissa Hortman and the attempted assassination of John Hoffman, my colleague here in the Senate. But it's been a journey that was a long time coming as well. I've been working on these issues for 20 years since I entered the House. In 2023, we passed the background check and the red flag laws, which are saving lives every day now in Minnesota, that set a platform for this, and then was able to develop a great partnership with Senator Zainab Mohammed, who represents the area of Annunciation and was very close with the families there, working hard to convene that working group together and to start to build ideas for how we might respond. Many of these ideas are already in the pipeline. And it was just a matter of trying to build the political consensus as well as refine the legislative proposals.
Yeah, I covered a number of those committee hearings in the past, and I was at those working group committees back in September. But we see in those committees, in that working group, and now on the floor debate, where this ultimately did pass right along party lines, the staunch divide between Democrats and Republicans on this issue that seemed to be at full display, that there is a clear divide about any legislation when it comes to guns themselves.
Well, there's a clear divide among the elected legislators here, but not among the general public. Although there are partisan leanings, when you poll individually the residents of Minnesota and ask them what is their view on banning assault weapons, or what is their view on limiting the capacity of magazines that hold the bullets, what is their view on binary triggers, on unserialized 3D printed ghost guns, as well as all the other stuff that we were doing. The public comes down strongly from mid-50s to high 80s in support of these various proposals, regardless of Democrat or Republican, regardless of gun owners or non-gun owners, because gun owners want society to be safe too. They want our kids to be safe too. They want responsible gun owners to safely store their firearms, make sure they're not accessible to people that have violent criminal histories. So that is not nearly as partisan. What you get on a vote here on the board in the Senate is strictly partisan. That does not reflect where the general public is. I'm confident if the GOP senators voted on each of these issues the way their districts would break down in support of each of these issues, we would have had almost a unanimous vote in support of this bill.
Now, this bill has the ban on assault-style weapons, high-capacity magazines, safe storage, but it also is the increased funding for school security and mental health care. On the Senate floor, there was an attempt to separate those out. The GOP members wanting to separate the school security, mental health funding, and send that over to the House. It went together, but how do you see this happening in the House, where it's completely a tie vote? Do you think there'll be an attempt to split it once again and send it back to you?
Well, I don't know if they'll even take it up on the floor for consideration in the House, because they've got a very different situation. They're in agreements on how they bring things to the floor. I would hope they would bring it up, and if they do, then they probably will try to split things out. That would be unfortunate, because the argument over the years has been, it's the people or it's the guns, and the fact is it's both. The people have issues that they have, and access to firearms, but the fact that they're using firearms to engage in their attacks is what makes it so much more lethal. If there's an incident of domestic violence that involves fists or knives, they're far less likely to result in deaths. If they involve firearms, 97% of the time, the violence results in a death, because when the firearm is used to shoot someone. So it's a very different situation. The irony here is that the Speaker of the House, Republican Speaker Representative Lisa Demuth, is currently being protected by a red flag law, a red flag order, because of threats against her by an individual in her district or somewhere in the state that had access to firearms. So they used the red flag law that we passed in 2023 to help protect her. This bill also included quite a number of updates, improvements proposed by prosecuting attorneys who are using the red flag law to make it easier, to add actually some additional protections for respondents, the parties that would be subject to the order, as well as make it better the way it works, and to improve public awareness that this tool is available. So if they know someone that is in crisis and has access to firearms, they know how to go about protecting themselves, protecting that person from committing suicide or from attacking someone else. The bill that we passed included funding for a public awareness campaign as well.
You called this a historic day, very, very historic, when this passed the Senate. Is that history, though, really at a roadblock now as it goes to the House? As you mentioned, you're not even sure if it'll be taken up on the House floor. Do you feel like this you made history in the Senate, but that might be it?
Well, it was an historic vote because it's the first time we've had a vote that passed the Senate on assault weapons bans and some of the other proposals that were in the bill. The real history will be made if and when the legislature as a whole passes it into law and begins reducing gun violence even more so than we've already done. That's where the real test will be. It comes up in the wake of some very emotional and terrifying incidents. And I don't know, we don't want to wait until the next tragedy once again to try to gather the political courage to pass this stuff. We want to prevent that next tragedy. In fact, the bill included funding for the Violence Prevention Project, which does research, basic statistical evidentiary research to determine what causes this kind of violent conduct, especially mass shootings. This bill really was a comprehensive, balanced package to try to reduce and evidence-based, because we know in other states that have done individual things like this, it actually reduces gun violence. So it's not a question of if or whether, it's a question of can we pass it and continue down the road of reducing gun violence in Minnesota. That's on the House of Representatives right now.
Yeah, and that's, I guess, the question is what happens now? Have you had conversations with your colleagues in the House in either party about what happens now?
Well, I believe that the leadership and the Democrats in the House are ready and willing to take this up and pass it. I think the roadblock is the Republican leadership in the House, because they're split 67-67. I think it's time they step up to the plate as well, because this will save lives, and if they don't pass it, there will be people who will lose their lives because of that.
And if there is an attempt or actually happens where this is divided and a school safety funding, mental health care funding does get past the other chamber and comes back to you, would you support that or say, no, it has to be comprehensive, these all have to remain together?
Well, that remains to be seen, I think. We've been passing school safety funding initiatives along the way and mental health funding initiatives, you know, year after year we pass something, or we establish the school safety officer, officers in state government to provide this kind of advice. Can and should we expand it? Yes. But I really think we ought to be working on a comprehensive package because, it's not enough just to pass school safety funding. We've got to do a lot more, and this is the time to do it.
All right. Senator Ron Latz, Chair of the Senate Judiciary and Public Safety Committee, DFLer, representing the West Metro. And again, a long history of advocating for gun legislation, and again, now getting this passed through the Senate this week. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
And just ahead, we'll be having a conversation with Republican Senator Steve Drazkowski, who spoke at length on the floor during the debate on his opposition, his criticisms, why he says these things, elements of this legislation, will not work. That's just ahead when we come back. Welcome back to All Day Live here on this Thursday afternoon. One other thing that we're going to be waiting for, keeping an eye on in about 10-15 minutes or so, the Minneapolis City Council, members of them will be speaking about some of the actions they took today, as well as the renomination of Chief Brian O'Hara for another 4 years as the city's police chief, and where that goes from here. Yeah, the last segment we had a conversation with DFL Senator Ron Latz about the comprehensive gun legislation, public safety legislation that passed the Senate right along party lines earlier this week. 34-33, nobody crossing party lines. Now we want to have a conversation with somebody from the other side of the aisle, Republican Senator Steve Drazkowski, who not only voted against the bill, but spoke at length on the floor here about his opposition. I know you just came in from a vote, so you're trying to get resituated there in front of the camera. Thank you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Let's talk about this. You spoke for quite a while, and I know there was a move to try to split out some of the gun portions of this legislation. You know, the assault weapon ban, the high-capacity magazines, some of the other things from the school safety, the school hardening, and the mental health support that didn't pass. So it remained connected. You were saying that in the other chamber, it would have a chance to pass part of it, not all of it, if it stays together.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly there's support in our caucus too, for some of the school hardening things, some of the mental health things, and focusing on things that can actually solve the problem. And what you have here is some of those things that can be part of the solution, some of which you've mentioned, tied in with a whole bunch of far left ideology of getting rid of guns and keeping law-abiding gun owners from operating and using the guns that they use in their everyday life. While it will do nothing to solve the problem is we have people that have mental health issues that end up going into schools with the knowledge that when they go in, they're going to die there. We don't have to go any further than to read some of the manifestos of some of the school shooters, not only the Annunciation school shooter, but those throughout the country. The Annunciation school shooter actually said he chose that school rather than other targets because it's a gun-free zone. In other words, because they post on the school, no guns allowed, he knew that there would be no guns inside of the school in order to counteract him and his efforts. And he actually read the manifestos of other school shooters before making that decision and understanding it. So understand that these people are mentally very, very deranged when they do this. And so we need to find a solution that works and protects schools and protects students when this far left ideology of taking people's guns away and they're taking away the guns that they are trying to scare people with, guns that have certain fixtures and attachments to them, thumb hole grip and some other things that somehow look scary or they can portray as scary to people. They're scaring people in order to move their agenda when actually we should be working towards solutions that will actually solve the problem.
Yeah, and you mentioned that.
We need to focus on that school environment and the person who's mentally deranged trying to and choosing that school because he or she knows there will be no resistance when they go there. We need to bring cops back into the school again. They actually in the bill had a provision in there that they got rid of the ability for trained individuals to be able to conceal carry in the school to protect the schools and protect the students. So they're taking away the ability for schools and the people in there to protect themselves. And like I said on the Senate floor, the first people they call when there's a school shooting is a good guy with a gun. And that's the police. Yeah,
you had mentioned too, as you talked about, why isn't a pump shotgun or a pistol in this bill? They are weapons as well. And but I think what we've heard in some of the committee hearings, certainly leading up to this, is doctors saying that it's these assault-style weapons that have a ability to shoot at a faster rate, that also at a faster velocity, that do far more damage to a human body, especially a small human body, than the other weapons. And that's the delineation that they make here. What's your view on that?
I find it interesting that doctors are somehow firearms experts. If you were a mentally deranged person and you really wanted to do damage, you wouldn't choose an AR-15. You would choose a shotgun with a 3-inch Magnum round in it filled with buckshot. That would be 22 or 33 caliber rounds, 15 to 18 or 20 pellets getting pushed out in a wide area. You'd be able to do all kinds of horrible damage if you were a horrible person. So they aren't even accurate in that. That is not the most dangerous weapon, in my estimation, and in the estimation of a lot of other people. I don't know why we believe that doctors are firearms experts. We would ask them to, focus on doctoring, and what we need to focus on is why are these horrible people that are in an evil state and in our evil state of mind, and they're acting in a heinous way. Why are they choosing gun-free zones? And not only, as I mentioned, not only was it the Annunciation shooter, it was several other that I mentioned in my floor speech. I don't have the names of them, but they're happening around the country this way, and they're studying each other. When these deranged people say they're going to do something and they're doing it because of that, and then they actually follow through on it like this individual did, we need to start paying attention. And for you guys in the media, you didn't even cover that reality. It would behoove us to actually focus on the root of the problem. And the root of the problem here is there's nobody in that school to be able to defend themselves. If this bill passes into law and the AR-15s are suddenly not legal anymore in the state of Minnesota, guess what? The law-abiding gun owners will follow that law. But that deranged shooter will not follow that law. He'll have an AR-15 either illegally in Minnesota, or he'll get it from Wisconsin, or he'll go to another state, or he'll have a shotgun, or he'll have a set of pistols, or he'll have a car or something else. We got to focus on the problem, and the problem here is not guns. Guns don't jump off the table and decide to shoot somebody one day. They're just simply a tool, an inanimate object that is what people are choosing in this situation. We need to focus on the people. It's a people issue. People kill people. Guns don't kill people.
As this heads over to the House now that it has passed the Senate, it's not anticipated that it will get anywhere in the House. What conversations have you had with your colleagues over there?
I think that's probably accurate. I mean, we did try to strip out the far left ideology, gun control stuff out of the bill, and we were unsuccessful. The Democrats in the Senate were steadfast in saying we have to have that. That's really what they're interested in. And I mean, there's members in our caucus, and I think in the House Republican caucus, that are willing to put some taxpayer money into hardening and protecting schools, getting law enforcement back into schools again. The Democrats have worked to defund cops and to give them a black eye in this state. We need to have a good guy with a gun or a good gal with a gun in this school to protect people. That will actually solve the problem. Democrats are misleading Minnesota here and selling them a bill of goods. It's a bait and switch. You know, we're going to take the guns away and suddenly they're not going to show up there. That's not true. They're misleading you. They're misleading Minnesotans, and our eye is off the ball.
So, do you see a potential scenario in which the House may split this bill, as the attempt was made on the Senate, into taking the issues apart and sending it back, or do you think nothing happens from this point on?
I haven't talked to leadership in the House. I mean, as I mentioned, if we had some of those other elements, school hardening, where we actually gave schools some funding to put cops in the school, to do some redesign of the schools to protect students, some mental health stuff, and that type of thing. If we had that, I think that certainly those colleagues in the House would entertain it. I don't know if it's going to fit into this particular session. We've got, after today, we start in session again Monday, and by the following Sunday, we're done.
Yeah, time is running short. Thank you for taking time with us today. Appreciate it. GOP Senator Steve Drazkowski of Mazeppa. Thanks for the time.
Thank you.
All right, there you go.